We're here today with the editors of God and Guns, The Bible Against American Gun Culture, Christopher B. Hayes and Carly L. Crouch. Chris is the D. Wilson Moore Professor of Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's the author of Hidden Riches, a source book for the comparative study of the Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East, The Origins of Isaiah 24 through 27, and Death in the Iron Age 2 and in First Isaiah, which won the Manfred Lautenschlager Award for Theological Promise in 2013. Carly L. Crouch is professor of Hebrew Bible and Old Testament and Ancient Judaism at Radboud University in the Netherlands. She's the author of War and Ethics in the Ancient Near East, Israel and the Assyrians, The Making of Israel, and An Introduction to the Study of Jeremiah. She's president of the Pacific Coast region of Society of Biblical Literature and serves on the editorial boards of several series, including Westminster John Knox's Press, Old Testament Library, for which she's writing a volume on the book of Amos. So thank you both so much for joining us.
Good to be here with you. Thanks for having us.
So you've got an interesting new book, and I want to obviously dive into that. But before we get there, maybe you could just, each of you, tell us just a little bit more about your backgrounds beyond what I touched on.
Go for it.
Sure. Well, since I know that many of your viewers are writers, I'll share that I have a long background with different kinds of writing. I've been a published poet. I've been a newspaper journalist, and then I found my way into academia, searching for something that would feel more enduring to spend my life on. And so, I found my way to seminary, and then onto the PhD in Hebrew Bible, and finally here to Fuller in 2008, where I've been ever since, teaching seminarians and writing. I guess so. If you want to hear about my books, I can say a couple words about those. Or
yeah, sure, that'd be great.
So I came out of a sort of comparative approach to the ancient Near East. So my first book is a fairly classic dissertation trying to contextualize the prophet Isaiah's rhetoric about life and death in light of how life and death were viewed in the ancient Near East. But I think it's my second book that has been the most fun for me. It's called Hidden Riches, and it's a kind of a textbook trying to explain to lay people or just the man on the street why people would want to compare the Bible with other ancient literature and what comes out of it when you do that. And so that's been a nice thing to be able to hand to people who want to know more about our field.
Cool. Carly, go ahead.
Thanks. So I have a fairly classical, straight into academia kind of background and training, straight through and into an academic position. But my interests have tended to revolve a lot around issues of ethics and the intersection between ethics and theology, and ethics and cultural context, and historical contexts. So one of my first book was on war and ethics in the ancient Near East, and it was particularly trying to think about how ideas about war and violence connected with war were formed and shaped in response to particular social and historical contexts. I've worked on various other sorts of texts and topics since then, but this interest in connecting the biblical texts and their origins in particular contexts with their ethical views, and then thinking then in contemporary terms about how our own historical and social contexts form us as ethical and moral thinkers has been a recurring kind of concern of mine. So God and Guns is part of that wider interest and kind of project.
And as I mentioned, you're at Radboud now, but you were previously at Fuller.
That's correct. Yes. So I spent a few years at Fuller Seminary, having really lovely, fantastic conversations with particularly students who are really engaged with these questions of how do we connect these ancient texts to the contemporary questions and concerns of our modern world. So God and Guns, we did another conference on migration issues and what the Bible might have to say into contemporary so-called migration crisis. I've done a little bit of work on American incarceration practices, thinking about what a prophetic voice like the book of Ezekiel might have to say to that system. And, you know, those really arose out of conversations with students. So that's been really, you know, a privilege to have those conversations.
So the new book that you've edited that I mentioned, you know, God and Guns, the Bible Against American Gun Culture, I read that is the first book to argue against gun culture from a biblical studies perspective, which is very interesting. Is that what motivated you to write that?
Yeah, it's quite striking. If you search Amazon on the keywords God and guns, the kinds of things that pop up are not, shall we say, carefully argued theology. It's usually sort of in the pro-gun camp, and the idea that God wants us all to have as many guns as possible, and, you know, T-shirts and things like that. So it was surprising not to see more work in this space. Of course, there are some great things out there. These are mentioned in the preface to the book. There have been theologians who have been trying to think broadly about this issue, and some pastors who've written books on the practical aspects of it. But I think that what we try to do as scholars is to, in part, is to work, you know, with the Bible to hear what it's saying, and to help our students and our readers here. And this is a topic on which we really couldn't find other work. And so, we had a conference. We've been in touch through social media and other contacts with other faculty around the country who have been just as troubled by this as we have for years. It's been this ongoing crisis. And so when we decided, with the help of Professor Crouch's chair fund, to hold this conference, we knew some people that we could reach out to, and sure enough, this came together fairly quickly. And so we met and talked and gave these lectures, and then really worked them into a book that is written for a popular audience, and not an academic book, but that really does take a deep dive into the Bible, you know, both testaments, and comes up with some great resources.
Well, you know, I just love the fact that, you know, that's the approach you guys have taken, you know, to take, you know, the deep study and take it outside of the walls of the seminary, and, you know, to make it accessible for the rest of us. I just think that's an incredibly important thing, and valuable thing for us all. So thanks for, you know, making the effort to do that. So the book is a compilation of chapters from different folks. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Yes, we asked really about half a dozen colleagues to come at this issue, you know, which of course is not addressed explicitly in the biblical texts. You know, guns were not a thing 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And so we asked a number of colleagues to come to this issue, to think creatively, to think about how you know, biblical texts, biblical, you know, values, priorities, concerns might speak into this issue. So we have Brent Strawn and Yolanda Norton. Chris writes an essay. Tracy Lamoche, Shelley Matthews, and Dave Lincecum. So a range of scholars from across the country, from a variety of different intellectual, religious, cultural backgrounds, training institutions, all bringing their voices to bear on this issue. Yeah.
One of the key things here, you know, as Carly mentioned, that there are no texts about guns in the Bible, and so one of the things that I think tends to happen in these debates is that people start to focus on a very limited set of proof texts. So it's often texts about swords, right? And so David Lincecum in particular does take on those texts, but I think that what's nice about it is that you have these scholars who know the Bible more comprehensively, who have actually brought in some other really interesting material. So like Tracy talks about the bow as a weapon, and what the bow symbolizes in the Bible and its world, and then what that means about masculinity, and what, you know, why men seem to want guns so much. What kind of powers that symbolizes for them. I'm working with the text where Isaiah tells Hezekiah not to fortify the city, not to practice self-defense if it's done unjustly. And so we're really, I think that what this could do for a church reading group or for a pastor who wants to preach a sermon series is to point them to a whole bunch of new resources that would, open up new vistas and not just the same old, same old.
So would you say that among the different contributors in their chapters, there's a relatively universal overarching viewpoint, or is there more controversy within the book?
No, this is not a book about the controversy. There's enough controversy out there in the culture. I think that what we have tried to do, though, is to write this from a sympathetic standpoint. And so in my preface, I talk about the fact that my grandfather was a rancher that had a case of guns in his living room, and that I shot skeet, with the Boy Scouts. And so we're not foreigners to guns. And Stanley Hauerwas's forward also takes a story from his background where his father gave him a gun and he was rude to his father and now feels bad about that, but still, still believes that it's a problem. So we hope it's a book that can be read by people who are not yet convinced that the witness of the Bible is a fairly nonviolent witness, and we hope that they'll find it ironic, but it is unified in. I mean, it's the subtitle. It's the Bible against American gun culture, so that there are no misrepresentation of it being a pro and con type of book.
Super. So who would you say is the primary target audience then for the book?
Interested parties across a pretty wide range of contexts. I mean, perhaps amongst the obvious target demographics, lay Christians in the pews, people who perhaps are living and working in contexts where guns are prevalent, are trying to think carefully and thoughtfully about what the biblical texts might have to say about gun ownership and the use of guns, the place that guns have in American culture. One of the things that comes up in a number of the essays is the question of, particularly for Christians, how guns and particularly the social and value that's been placed on guns in a lot of segments of American society, is that compatible with an explicitly Christian orientation and way of life? You talk a little bit at greater length about this. God and the gun is essentially competing, orientating perspectives.
One of the things that comes out of some of the social scientific data, there is a correlation between people who call themselves Christian and gun ownership. However, that breaks down when you look at who actually goes to church and is part of a faith community in an active way. So that there's a kind of a nominal cultural Christianity that correlates with higher gun ownership, but it's less so with people who actually take part actively. I would just add that if we could get this book into the hands of Sunday school groups all over the country, that would be my best goal. Read a chapter a week, meet and talk about it and how that plays out in your own area. That would be fantastic. We've also had friends who teach in colleges and seminaries who've written to us and said that they plan to use this in that type of coursework. So, various options, I think, hopefully.
Good. So maybe each of you could answer this next question too. If there was one particular thing that you'd like for people to take away from the book, what would it be?
One particular thing. Well, maybe I'll list a couple. One is that there's a myth of self-defense that guns make us safer. And I mean, even though the book is not about the gun data per se, it does lead with a whole bunch of stats about guns. And one is that you are far more likely to be killed by your own gun if you have one in the house than you are to keep yourself safe with it. So it's not actually a sort of a good self-defense tool. But secondly, I suppose that the message that you might take away from both mine and David Lincecum's articles is that the example of Christ calls us to something other than mere personal self-defense. It calls us to self-sacrifice and to a care for the whole world that is just as concerned about our neighbor's safety as our own. And that when we live in a culture that's poisoned by this huge proliferation of firearms, that it creates a very unsafe and frightening world for our neighbors, our children, our families. And so we have to aim for better as a culture.
And I think I just pick up on that and focus in on really the consequences of gun culture for the most vulnerable members of our society. Whether that is children who are living in homes with firearms. The statistics on firearms accidents involving children are utterly tragic. Then beyond sort of the immediate confines of the home, the proliferation of guns and a highly militarized, violent culture, in neighborhoods and segments of our communities that are already vulnerable, and that's in many places turned into a spiraling, a downward spiral of violence between the state and people on the street, and the consequences for our social fabric, for our communities have been really catastrophic. And so, as Chris said, the need for healing and care for our communities, and particularly those who are especially vulnerable in our communities, is a really significant thread of the book.
Well, amen to both what you said. I am appreciative of this book, and I really hope that it has a big impact, quite frankly, in a much badly needed arena. So, I'm really glad that you wrote it. I hope that it does well in terms of its breadth and distribution. I mean, it's only recently been released, right? I mean, how has it done so far? What kind of reaction have you had?
It's been too soon to see the sales numbers of it. I suppose it's probably been ranked okay on Amazon, and but we tend to only get the year-end reports, and but I will say this, that I mean we've done 4 or 5 different podcast type interviews with different people. So from the standpoint of the PR interest, it's been far beyond most of what we write. I think that's safe to say.
Yeah, and I think anecdotally, I mean, I think certainly our experience of the public reaction to this book has been very different than, we certainly write scholarly books for our scholarly audiences, and, people in our fields are interested in those things, but there's been a much wider and, really quite robust response to the announcements of the publication. People being in touch with us, asking if it's coming out in ebook, if it's coming out in audiobook. It is coming out as an audiobook. And so, a real interest that's been really wonderful to see.
I think that there'll be 2 phases with this book's reception. So it's a kind of a high 5 thumbs up book where people hear just that you've done it and they're like, oh, cool, high 5, great. But then, I just had a friend who's a faculty member outside of theology who's not a Christian at all, who wrote to me yesterday to say, wow, this is so great. This is what Christianity needs. So I'm hoping that it's it's a better representation of Christianity out there in the culture than how we're usually linked with guns, which is as pro-gun. But we're also hoping for a long tail, as it were, with the reception. We're hoping to hear back in 2 or 3 years that that someone's taught this book, that someone has had their church read this book, and that it's changed the conversations in all those different contexts that we're hoping to inspire. So I'm not, we're not concerned about the sales as such, but we're hoping to change the culture.
I mean, I think there's a really good chance of both what you said, kind of an immediate impact here, around the book launch, but then also that long tail. I think that this will be a valuable reference for people going forward. It's not just going to be a flash in the pan. I mean, unfortunately, it's a need that probably isn't going to go away very quickly. So it's going to be needed.
Yep.
So anything you can talk about in terms of future collaboration or writing that either one of you want to talk about?
Oh, I suppose I might mention, you mentioned I'm working on a book on Amos. One of my intentions, my hopes with that, so that book will be targeted also for a fairly broad audience, preachers, church folk, also some scholars. But one of the things that I'm particularly interested in thinking about in that book are the ways that this ancient prophetic texts continue to speak, especially into political and social ethical issues of today. How various concerns, particularly about poverty, about abuse of power, continue to speak. So I'm looking forward to getting further on in that project.
I don't want to say too much about this, so I'll be slightly vague, but I have a forthcoming project with my father, Richard Hayes, who was at Duke University for many years, that will be on human sexuality, and will be a sort of co-authored work of theology, somewhat similar to God and Guns, but just the two of us, and trying to once again reshape that a conversation about what's been a very divisive issue, particularly within the church and also somewhat within U.S. politics. So yeah, I'm continuing to try to reach beyond the guild and my fellow scholars, and while also, keeping my more traditional scholarship rolling, which is probably a whole other ball of wax from this conversation.
Sure. Well, please keep me posted on, both of your works. And, it sounds like some great things that you're going to be continuing to do. And I really want to thank you guys for the courage that you showed to come out with this book. That's obviously got some controversy to it, but, incredibly badly needed. So thank you so much for that.
A great pleasure.
Really.
So other than Amazon, where can people learn about the book and about both of you?
So the publisher is Westminster John Knox, and so the book is available directly from them in all of its forms. As I said, print copy, ebook, audiobook is forthcoming, and both of us are very Googleable. So probably our faculty web pages and so on are.
Academia.edu is a place that I keep up to date, and I have a Facebook group called Ancient Near Eastern Studies at Fuller, which is fairly widely followed. So if people want to hear more about that side of my work, those two are good options.
Yep. And I have a personal website, which is carlylcrouch.net, where I sometimes post about projects. So.
Fantastic. Well, Carly and Chris, thank you so much for, doing this work and for spending time with us. And I'm glad to help you get the word out about it.
Thank you,
Brian. Thank you.